out here at the Robbins Racing, Warner Robins, Georgia. We're getting with the owner. They're having church over there, so we're not gonna stop them from praising. You still might hear a little bit of the sound inside, but we're at Robbins Racing. The owner here, Rodney, is gonna do a little series on my channel, but then the next few videos you'll start seeing are gonna be on his channel, talking about RC, tuning, setup, soldering, all kind of need to know, functional training videos. But then of course, you could come support his store.
Wire out here. We'll put a few things together here. Exactly.
The station that he uses is the Horizon Hobby TK950 solder station.
We'll do a Dean's and we'll do a XT90. I think that pretty much covers everything, right?
Yep.
We'll do a Traxxas one, but I don't have a damn Traxxas connected down here.
So, Rodney from Robbins Racing, we're going to do a little segment today on soldering. So, a couple of things we're going to cover here. You've got different types of connectors. This is your XT90 connector. You've got your male and your female connector. You've got your XT60, which is a mini version of that same type of connector. Then you've got your flat plug connectors, such as your Dean's connector. Some people call these the T connectors, but it's called a Dean's. And then you got your EC3, EC5 type connectors where your pins will come out of them. Same thing with your Traxxas connectors. Okay, so we're going to be using a set of helping hands. We've got some flux. We're going to be using rosin core 0.3 millimeter soldering wire. And then, as he said earlier, we've got our TK950 soldering iron.
Boom. And he has them available.
Mm-hmm. The other thing we'll be using is a voltmeter so we can ohm out our connections when we're done. Make sure everything's good to go.
When you ohm them, what are you looking for?
So when you ohm out a connection, you're looking for breaks in your connection, right? You want a solid connection between it. And a good example of that, if we turn this on. So right now, my wires I've got in my hand here, if you notice, if I hold those two together, this should go down to about a 0.4, maybe a 0.3. That's about the best I can do pushing that together, but there's a break between those two contacts, right? So at a very minimum, I want 0.4 or less, right?
Right.
When I solder those together, that's going to tell me that I've got a good connection. If it's 0.6 or 0.7, that means I don't have a good solid connection. That's what I'm looking for. That's how you test your solder. We're going to talk about wire gauge. So this I've got in my hand here, this is a 10 gauge wire. It's a really large gauge wire. This is going to be a 12 gauge wire. As you can see the difference there. We're going to cover these today. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to strip back your insulation on your wire to open up some bare wire on those. That's good. We're going to tin our wires. Now this is real important. Your wire, especially if it's been exposed, you got oil on your fingers, you got dirt on your table, things like that, right? And it's going to get on that wire. Any kind of external material that's inside that wire is going to keep your solder from sticking to your wire. And if your solder don't stick to your wire, you got a break in your wire. So let's go ahead and tin these wires. By the way, I've got the Energy soldering block here. These things, you don't get close to that thing, it's nasty. All right, so what I got here, this is your standard solder. And you know, I've had this same jar of this stuff for probably 8 or 9 years. We've got it over here. This is these white tubes, what you're going to see a lot of times here in the States. Yeah, I sit here in the States. You can tell me, never mind. I messed it up. But basically, it's just a rosin flux. It doesn't really matter what brand it is. Doesn't really matter where you get it from. Rosin flux.
Boom.
All right, so we've got a piece of our 12 gauge wire here. We're going to tin both ends. We've already stripped the insulation off of both ends of it. And literally all I'm going to do is just get a little bit on my wire. That's all it takes right there. We're going to put that in there. Now I'm going to take my soldering iron. I've heated it up. A little bit about your soldering iron real quick before we get started here. If your soldering iron looks a little burnt on the end, or a little rusty. Notice how this one, it's got a nice little brass look to it. If I put a little solder on there, it sticks and melts nicely. If it bubbles up or it creates kind of a BB on there, what you want to do is wipe it on a wet sponge. And that's called tinning your tip. It should be a nice silver color, look like the color of the solder. So, soldering iron's ready to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of solder on the end of my soldering iron here. And then I'm going to apply my soldering iron to the bottom of my wire. And what's going to happen is that solder that's on the tip of my iron is going to soak up into the wire. If you don't have enough on there, you can add a little bit more to your tip. What you're going to looking for is the top of the wire start getting real shiny. You can see it right there. Now I can apply a little bit of solder to the top of the wire and it'll melt right in there. And effectively what I'm looking for is the wire to get not where there's so much solder that's dripping off, but where it's a nice concave look and I can tell that all the individual wires are connected together with solder. By doing that from the bottom versus going from the top, what it does is it allows the solder to melt up into the wire. So you've got solder not just on the outside of the wire, but all the way through it. We want to use the whole wire, not just the outside of the wire. So we're going to do the same thing. Now that flux we put on there earlier is what's causing that smoke. It's burning off any of that oil and stuff that was on my hands. And now my solder's sticking. As you can see, now I can melt it into the top of the wire. Got that nice concave look. Let it cool down.
Going through the process. I'm going to prep all of these. You'll see it back in the video in a second, guys.
This connector off.
Taking desoldering.
Desoldering, yep. Let's build a Traxxas to a Dean's connector. How about that?
Traxxas to a Dean.
Traxxas to Dean's. So what we're going to do first, we're going to tin them wires like we did before. Now this wire here has been exposed for a while, so I want to clean it up a little bit. Put my flux on there, burn off all that nasty stuff. Get us some fresh solder on there. Same thing on the other end. Nope, we ain't open yet. So, now what we're going to use, we got our wires ready to go. We're going to use our helping hands. I know this is going to be tricky. You can come right here behind me if you need it. So what we're going to do, one of these, let's start with this one right here. So on these Traxxas connectors, one side you're going to have some writing, or sometimes they'll have an A on it and a B on it. That's the side you're going to apply your solder to. You don't want to apply your solder to the smooth side, and the reason is because it's got these little tabs and that's what holds it in the connector. So you want to apply it to that smooth side. The other thing with the Traxxas connector is, I'll show you on this one here. Notice how you got these tabs on the side of your connector here and here. Make sure you don't get those covered in solder, okay? If you do, what's going to happen is your connector is not going to stay, your pin is not going to stay in your connector.
Got it.
Side of there. We'll get our wire ready to go. Now with the helping hands, the first thing you want to do, I get them close to where I want them so I can do this in one step like this. But before I put my wire onto my connector, I need to tin my connector, my pin. The way you do that is I'll take, I'm gonna burn your hand.
Get burned.
All right, so I got a little bit of solder on my tip. I don't want much. I'm gonna put some heat on the bottom of my connector, and then it's just gonna pull up right on top of that connector. It takes a little bit of heat. There it goes. I don't need much, just enough. Because what I'm doing when you put these together, you're not melting the wire to the connector, you're melting the solder to the solder. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and put my wire. I'm gonna position my wire on my connector so that there's a little bit of pressure coming up and a little bit of pressure from the wire going down, and it holds everything together. Now all I gotta do, I'm gonna get real close to see this part. Put a little bit of solder on my tip, and I'm gonna hold it right on top of my wire. What I'm doing is I'm gonna melt the solder on my wire until I see the solder on the connector melt, and it creates a nice little concave connection, just like that right there.
Got it.
All right. Connector here, if you can see it, from the wire, the solder curves around to the solder that's on the connector. So it's got a concave connection on it. Basically what I'm looking at is this port right here. So that solder we put on this connector melted to the solder on the wire. Same thing on this side. Nice concave. When that's, you can tell it's on there tight because I can't break that off of there. That's a good connection. That's what we're looking for.
Got it.
See how the solder on the connector's melting to the wire?
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what we want right there. It's a little bit exaggerated. I normally have mine a little cleaner than that, but to give you the idea, you can see how the solder on the connector melted to the solder in the wire. That's exactly what we want to do. Okay, so now we got our Traxxas connectors done. What we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and set these inside of our connector. Simply put them in. I like to use a flat bit screwdriver or an Allen wrench, something that can get down in there good. Put it on the back of the connector. Be careful not to hit your fingers because it wouldn't hurt. Push on the back of the connector till it goes in and clicks, just like that. We'll do the same thing on the other side. We'll put it in, push in till it clicks, and that's it. Our wires are in there. That's a solid connection. Now we're gonna put our Deans on there. You guys are familiar with this Deans connector, T connector. Now this is a female Deans connector. Don't get confused because your tab's coming out the back. That's not the male side of the Deans connector. That's the side you're gonna put your wire to. This is a female Deans connector. So we're making a female Traxxas connector to a female Deans connector. One thing to keep in mind that's real important: positive and negative, right? You get your wires backwards, you're gonna burn some stuff up. So on a Deans connector, your flat one, that's your positive, and your horizontal one, that's your negative. So on the back of the connector, this is your positive side, this is your negative side. All right, we're gonna use our helping hands again. Our connector into our helping hands. Let's see what's gonna be the best way to do it. We'll do our negative side first. Now it don't really matter which side of the tab you use. One side sits a little lower than the other, so I usually go to that side of it. You can kind of look at it and tell, but put my wire in there. We're doing negative. Again, we're going to tend the tips of these connectors so we can melt our solder to our solder. A little bit of solder on my iron. Put a little heat to my connector. Right like that right there. Now then I'm going to put my wires together. Just like so. A little bit of downward pressure on my wire. And then I'm literally just going to apply a little bit of pressure to it. Let my solder melt together. You don't want to hold them wires when you're doing this, it'll get real hot. Just like that. You want to let it set for a minute, make sure everything cools down. You can see it go from nice shiny like liquid to kind of a dull gray color. That's how you know it's hardened up. Alright, I'm just going to simply flip this bad boy over. Once I do this, I use this device. Put that in there. We're going to tend that tip again. The right tools make every job easier.
Correct.
Put a little bit of solder on my tip. On the bottom. Put a little heat to it. Just like that. Now what I'm going to use, my needle nose pliers to hold my wire. That way I don't burn my finger. Put that bad boy up there. Shrink on it, but this is just to show the soldering. So hold it till it gets hard. Done. Okay, we got a good connection. I always give mine a little bit of a bend, make sure, you know, pull on, tug on a little bit, make sure it's good. That's a good solid connection right there. Now what we're going to do though, the reason I left the heat shrink off of it, we're going to test it.
Right.
All right, put my wire out the way. Put this old jar of flux out the way. All right. So now we've got our female Traxxas to female Deans connector. And again, we didn't put any heat shrink on there on purpose. So I'm going to show y'all something. So, turning my voltmeter on. I use 200 ohms when I do this. test it real quick. Yeah, we get down to 4. So we're working with the voltmeter. Get that in there. All right, now I'm gonna come down here to my negative side. I'm just gonna push that inside of there. Check out what we got right there, 0.04. That's exactly what we want to see. So that's a good solid connection. Come around here to the other side, we'll check our positive connection, do the same thing. Now mind you, if you're getting something on the negative side, when you hook up to the positive, that's bad. All right. Right there, we're at 0.4 on the positive side. So we got a good solid connection. All right, let's talk a little bit about connectors. So earlier we talked about you got your XT60s, your XT90s. This is an EC3. Just show a little bit about how to put wire on these. So the XT60s and the XT90s, the thing about these is that the connectors don't come out of the casing. And if you put too much heat to these, they'll move. If they move, it won't go together. So that's something you gotta be real careful about when you solder these. Now there's a trick that I figured out. I'm gonna put a little shout out there to Mr. Randy Williams, because he showed me this one. But let's say we're gonna do this male connector, what we're gonna add our wires to. Take the female connector, push it inside of it. What that does is it's gonna hold those pins in the right place. So if you accidentally get too much heat to it, it won't move. All right, so again, positive and negative is important. On the top of the connector here, it's got a negative mark and a positive mark, right? Same thing on the largest ones, maybe a little easier to see. You've got a positive and a negative. So that's important, remember, don't hook your wires up backwards. That's bad juju. All right, so we're gonna take this connector, set it in place. First thing we wanna do, put a little bit of tenon on our connection. Real simple, same thing we did before. We're just gonna throw a little heat to it on the bottom side of that connector, melt some solder in there just like that. Our wire, I'm gonna use a 12 gauge wire. I'm just gonna literally hold my wire right in place. Now use a helping hand, use a pair of pliers, it will get hot. Put a little heat to it. Once the heat gets down through the wire, it'll melt that solder inside that connector. That's what you're waiting on. If you're trying to do it like I am right here and you're not getting anywhere, what you might have to do, put a little more solder on the tip of your soldering iron. If you got a dry tip, sometimes it doesn't transfer the heat very well. Be patient, don't get in a hurry. Unless your fingers are getting real hot, then get in a hurry. What in the heck is going on here? I solder on the wire. Like I said before, wire don't melt, so solder melts. We're gonna use a helping hand since we already got it here. Throw that right there in place. Drop some heat on it. Bam. There she goes right there.
Makes all the difference.
Yep. Typically, if you, like right there, if you're doing something wrong, you'll know, because it ain't gonna work. Positive side, same thing. We're gonna tip the end of our connect, put some solder, melt that in there. Get our wire where we want it. We don't want to hold it. Try not to touch the cameraman with the soldering iron.
That wouldn't feel too good.
Yeah, but if we got it on film, it'd be funny. All right, get a wire in place where we want it. I know it's not a great view. Melt that bad boy down in there. Just like that right there. Let it harden. Now at this point, what I would normally do, once this cools down, put a little heat shrink on them bad boys. Cover them up, right? That's what we're looking for. That's a good connection. Take a good close look at your connection. What you should see, you shouldn't see any holes and pits, and you know, there might be up here at the front because your wire may not go inside your connector, but you're looking at the sides of that connector. Make sure that the solder on the wire melted to the solder on the connector real good. You don't want a big glob of solder sticking off of the top of it or anything like that. It should be a nice clean connection. Give it a good twist, good pull. That's good solder connection. Take your voltmeter out, you can test that out, but that's what you're looking for. At this point, again, put your heat shrink on there, heat shrink those connections up so they won't touch, and go ahead and do the other end for whatever you need it to be. Now the reason we left those connectors in there is because now, even if I got that too hot, those connectors didn't move inside there. That's it, that's all there is to it. Same thing with the XT90. If you solder these up, use a either a male or female, depending on which one you're soldering connector. Put them together, solder them together like that. Holds them together better so they don't move around. All right, last thing we're going to talk about right here is going to be your connectors that come out of your pins that come out of your connectors, such as the EC3 here. You've also got your EC5. The way I do these is I use a block where I can hold that connector straight up and down, right? I'm going to try to do this where you can see it this way. All right, so turn that cup facing you to where you can see it. Now you want to be real careful how much solder you apply to the outside of this on your tip. Too much solder on the outside is going to be a problem. There's a little bevel down here at the bottom of this connector. That's what holds this pin. That's what holds this pin inside your connector. If you get solder on that, it won't stay in your connector. So if you're worried about this, don't put any solder on your tip. Just be patient and it will melt into there. I'm going to apply just the smallest amount of solder to my tip of my iron. Now then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put heat to the outside of my connector. I always apply heat to the opposite side of whatever I'm soldering. That way my solder will go through fully. Put some solder inside the cup, a little bit up on the back side of that bad boy. Take a wire. Let's pretend this thing real quick. You know what, let's do this. Let's use this connector we've already started making. It's already 10. All right, so my wire, notice how my insulation's hitting. It ain't quite going down as far as I want it to go. So I'm gonna take a little bit more of that insulation off of it. All right. I'll add a little bit of solder to the tip of that wire. I like to have any of my exposed wire, I like to have solder all the way through it. Just holds everything together better. All right. Now then, what I'm gonna do here is I'm just simply gonna take that connector, put it in there, inside of what I soldered, and then I'm gonna apply a little bit of heat from the back side again, and what you're gonna see is you're gonna see it all just melt together. It's like butter. Except don't taste it. It don't taste good. Again, patience is the key to this job. It's right there. You can feel it go together. Take your heat away from it. Wait for it to harden. You got a beautiful connection. You got solder down in the cup in there. You can see how it's all concave around your wire and everything like that. That's exactly what you're looking for. Just like that. We'll do the other side here. We'll do that one more time. Put my connector in there. Throw a little heat to the back side of the connector. Just a touch on my soldering tip. Just like it right there. Nice and shiny. Take our wire. Put it down in there. Now if your wire don't want to go into your connector, you may have to take a piece of sandpaper or grinder or something, just to take a little bit of the wire off there. It's a solid connection because you tinned it, and that's okay. Or sometimes you can get it just to melt into place once that solder melts. Goes down in your cup, let it harden. Just like that. That's all there is to them. All right, now before you put these connectors back inside of your connector, before you put your pins inside your connector, you need to let your wires cool down. This is real hot right now. If we put it inside of here, we're liable to melt something. So we're gonna let that cool down for a few minutes. Again, patience is the key. Once it cools down enough to where you can touch them, it don't take long. Heat comes out pretty quick. At that point, you can go ahead and put your connector together. Be real careful with these now, because if you put your negative in your positive or your positive in your negative, you can't take it apart. You got to start all over again. Also, if you accidentally get too much solder on the outside out here, like when you're putting a little solder on your tip, you can take a Dremel or something, sand that down just a little bit just to clean it up. It just helps them go together. In this case, we're pretty good to go. There's a little speck on there, but I think we'll be fine. So we're going to put our negative in the negative hole, the positive in the positive hole. Now at this point, before I put these together, I would usually put my heat shrink on here that I'm going to use to cover these up with. Put them in there. Now these are a little bit tricky. I use a really fine tip Allen wrench. Use a good one. Push them down till they click. Just like that. Y'all heard that. Okay, how long don't want to go? Oh, I see one. That's how you put it together.
And there you have it, guys. Robin's tutorial. What is your naming sequence for these? One.
I'm Rodney. This is Robin's Racing. This is going to be our first video on soldering. So we'll do some more videos on different things. Biggest thing what we're doing is we're making videos up for a lot of the questions we get asked here in the hobby shop. A lot of the things that are, I don't want to call them basic, but things that a lot of people have trouble with in the RC world. So it takes practice, just like anything. Once you do it a little bit, you get good at it. There's basic techniques, but like I said earlier, the most important thing is having the right tools. You got the right tools, anybody can do this job.
And there you have it, guys. Robin's Racing. First tutorial on soldering. Stay tuned and also watch his upcoming YouTube channel, Robin's Racing on YouTube. And then, of course, if you're in Central Georgia, come support the store.
The thing is, if I make little videos of that, if I'm not here, I can show them the video, right? And they know how to do it.
I know you can't see all the stock up close, but just know that they got plenty of items to make it worth your trip. 7 scale bodies.
Just real quick tutorial on how to adjust your camber and your toe link. Right now we've got the TLR 8XE Elite buggy. It's a brand new little bad boy that just came out with. So on your RC car, what you're going to find is that the link across the top, that's your camber adjustment, and the link on the bottom is your toe adjustment. Now the thing about these is one end of the